Chicago traded Angel Reese to the Atlanta Dream in exchange for future draft picks, a second-round pick swap, and selections that won't convey until 2027. For a two-time All-Star who holds the single-season rebounding record, the return was minimal. The trade raised an immediate question: why would a franchise move a high-profile player for so little? The surface-level statistics made Reese appear valuable. She recorded double-doubles at a high rate and led the league in rebounding, but the team's record told a different story. In her first season, Chicago finished 13-27. The following year, they declined further, finishing 10-34. A player positioned as a franchise cornerstone typically improves a team's trajectory. In Chicago, the opposite occurred. A closer look at the efficiency numbers explains part of the disparity. Reese shot 39% from the field, a figure that is low for any player who operates primarily in the paint. Her percentage from 5 to 9 feet was 13%, and she connected on 18% of her three-point attempts. Opposing defenses had little reason to guard her away from the basket, which reduced spacing for her teammates. A portion of her rebounding totals also reflected what analysts call offensive self-creation, situations in which she missed a shot, recovered her own miss, and attempted again. The box score counted multiple rebounds. The possession count reflected diminishing returns. The on-court performance was compounded by reported friction within the organization. When veteran guard Courtney Vanderloot tore her ACL, Reese made public comments suggesting the team needed younger players who were willing to compete for a championship. Vanderloot is a two-time WNBA champion and five-time All-Star. The remarks were poorly received internally, and reports indicated Vanderloot was frustrated by the public characterization. Her relationship with Camila Cardoso, who was expected to form a complementary front-court pairing with Reese, also deteriorated over the course of the 2025 season. According to reports, Cardoso walked out during the season, and multiple players described the team environment as improved once the trade was completed. The Sky eventually suspended Reese for conduct detrimental to the team, a step organizations typically take after a sustained pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident. The suspension coincided with footage that circulated online showing Reese in Las Vegas during a period when she was listed as injured and unavailable for the team's final games. The Sky's front office had already been documenting the broader situation. The trade, when it came, reflected a calculated decision. The organizational cost of retaining her had exceeded whatever on-court value she provided. Atlanta now absorbs that cost. The Dream already roster Brittany Griner and Brianna Jones, two post players who operate in similar areas of the floor. Adding Reese to that group creates a structural spacing problem. Perimeter players like Ryan Howard and Alicia Gray depend on driving lanes that become congested when three players occupy the paint simultaneously. Defenses will be able to pack the interior and concede open looks that Reese is statistically unlikely to convert. Whether Atlanta's coaching staff has a workable system for this configuration remains unclear. The contrast with Indiana has been unavoidable in league discussions. Caitlin Clark, selected in the same draft class as Reese, broke 62 WNBA records in her first two seasons and helped move the Fever from years of irrelevance into playoff contention. The players around her, Aaliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, Lexi Hull, posted career-best numbers within Indiana's offensive system. Clark has handled sustained public attention and external pressure without documented locker room conflict. The Fever's record has improved each season she has been on the roster. The divergence illustrates a distinction that front offices are increasingly weighing: the difference between a player's media profile and her effect on winning. Chicago's decision to accept a below-market return was in effect an acknowledgement that the two had separated. The Sky retained Cardoso, a cleaner locker room environment, and draft capital that may develop into meaningful assets. Whether those picks produce contributors remains to be seen. What the organization has already recovered is operational stability. For Atlanta, the question is whether a change of environment produces different results. The Dream are betting that Reese's rebounding and name recognition justify the risk. Chicago already ran that experiment across 2 full seasons. The outcome is part of the public record. What makes the Atlanta gamble particularly difficult to assess is that the Dream are not a blank canvas. They entered the 2025 offseason with a defined identity, a guard-led, perimeter-oriented team built around Howard's scoring and Gray's versatility. That system produced results. Howard is one of the more complete offensive players in the league, capable of creating her own shot at multiple levels. Gray is a reliable secondary option who spaces the floor and defends at a high level. The infrastructure was functional. The addition of Reese does not obviously improve it. Post-dominant offenses are not inherently flawed, but they require specific conditions to work at the WNBA level. The floor needs to be spaced, the post player needs to be a credible passer out of double teams, and the overall pace of the team needs to accommodate the slower tempo that interior-heavy basketball typically produces. Atlanta currently lacks the floor spacing to support three post-oriented players. Reese has not demonstrated consistent passing out of the high post, and the Dream's backcourt is at its best in up-tempo situations. Adding Reese does not reinforce any of those conditions. It complicates them. Head coach Tanisha Wright will need to find minutes and a role that makes the combination functional rather than redundant. The most likely scenario is that Griner, Jones, and Reese will rarely share the floor simultaneously, with Wright staggering their appearances to maintain some semblance of spacing. But that approach creates its own problems. It reduces the minutes available to each of the three, limits their individual rhythm, and still does not resolve the core issue that Reese's offensive profile does not complement the players Atlanta has already built around. There is also the question of market expectations. Atlanta is a market that has historically underinvested in the Dream, and the franchise has used Reese's arrival to generate ticket revenue and media attention. That commercial logic is understandable. Reese's social media reach and public profile remain significant regardless of her on-court efficiency. But franchises that acquire high-profile players primarily for commercial reasons, without a coherent basketball rationale, tend to find the two goals working against each other when the losses accumulate. Fan goodwill generated by a marquee signing dissipates quickly when the team's record does not improve. The broader context here is a league in transition. The WNBA's recent expansion, combined with the audience growth driven in large part by the Clark-Reese dynamic during the 2023 NCAA tournament, has elevated the profile of the sport significantly. Television deals, attendance figures, and media coverage have all moved in a positive direction. That growth has also raised the stakes for competitive performance. Casual fans who arrive during the wave of interest are not guaranteed to stay if the product on the floor disappoints. Front offices are aware that the window to convert new interest into durable fandom is narrow, and that winning matters more in that context, not less. Chicago appears to understand that calculus. The Sky's front office under Jeff Pegioka has been transparent, at least implicitly, about the direction the franchise is taking. The decision to build around Cardoso represents a bet on a different type of player, one who moves within a system, defends consistently, and does not generate organizational friction. Cardoso is not a finished product. Her offensive game is still developing, and she will need reliable perimeter shooters around her to be effective at the next level, but the foundational elements are there. And the locker room climate following the trade was reportedly improved almost immediately. The draft capital Chicago accumulated, while modest, also opens a path to roster flexibility. Second-round picks in the WNBA have historically produced rotational contributors rather than stars, but in a league with only 12 teams and compressed roster sizes, even a reliable 6th or 7th player has disproportionate value. The Sky may not be positioned for a championship run in 2026, but they are no longer actively undermining themselves. That distinction matters. There is a category of team in professional sports that is not quite rebuilding and not quite competing. A team that has confused activity for progress, signed high-profile players without a coherent system, and found itself losing by a consistent margin while appearing on paper to have talent. Chicago spent 2 years in that category. The Reese trade, whatever its optics, was the decision that ended that phase. Whether the next phase produces wins will depend on Pagliaca's ability to build a roster that functions as a unit rather than a collection of individual profiles. It is worth noting that Reese is 23 years old. The characterizations of her professional ceiling are being drawn from a 2-year sample in a league she entered as a highly scrutinized rookie. Players develop, systems change, coaching adjustments can unlock efficiency that raw statistics do not yet reflect. It would be premature to conclude that her career arc is fixed. What is fair to say is that the developmental environment in Chicago did not produce improvement in the areas that matter most: shooting efficiency, decision-making, and team cohesion, and that Atlanta represents a test of whether different surroundings change those outcomes. Historical precedent on that question is mixed. Some players genuinely transform when removed from a difficult situation, others carry the same patterns into the next organization. The variables that tend to predict which outcome follows a trade are internal rather than external. Whether the player has an accurate read on what went wrong, and whether they are willing to make the adjustments required. Public statements from Reese following the trade did not suggest significant self-reflection. She characterized the move as an opportunity and expressed confidence in what she would bring to Atlanta. That may be the appropriate public posture regardless of private awareness, but it did not indicate the kind of reckoning that tends to precede genuine change. Indiana, meanwhile, has the most straightforward path of any team in the Eastern Conference. Clark enters the 2026 season healthy, with 2 years of professional experience, a playoff appearance, and a supporting cast that has grown alongside her. The Fever added depth in the offseason and addressed the defensive lapses that limited them in the prior postseason. The infrastructure Clark operates within is stable, collaborative, and oriented toward winning. There are no documented locker room issues. There is no structural spacing problem. There is no tension between commercial priorities and basketball ones. The gap between Indiana and the rest of the Eastern Conference is not yet decisive, but it is real. The Fever have built a sustainable competitive foundation at a pace that is unusual in a league where roster turnover is frequent and parity is structurally enforced. Their advantage is not primarily individual talent, though Clark is clearly a generational player. It is organizational coherence, the alignment between front office, coaching staff, and locker room that makes a team greater than the sum of its parts. That coherence is precisely what Chicago spent 2 seasons failing to achieve, and what Atlanta will now need to build around a roster that presents genuine compatibility challenges. The Sky gave away a player the entire league was watching. They did it because the alternative, another season of internal dysfunction, declining performance, and public distraction, was worse than the price of the exit. By the narrow but meaningful measure of organizational health, that decision has already paid off. Whether it translates to wins on the court is the next question. But in professional sports, teams that are healthy internally tend, over time, to become teams that win. Chicago is betting on that sequence. Atlanta is betting against it.